My name is Sarah Jakes. I'm from the New Nicotine Alliance in the UK, and I'll be chairing this session. Try my glasses. So this session is about evidence, accountability, transparency, and about whose science counts in this arena. So I think we all know that if there's one thing that the vaping debate has shown us, is that good research certainly appears to be in the eye of the beholder. It seems that on a daily basis science is created, debated, debunked, deflated, and the very public arena that this happens in is confusing for consumers and regulators alike. So who can and who should we trust? Should voices be silenced simply because of who the speakers are? Or should we be taking all evidence on its merits? If we can determine what those merits are, of course. So here to discuss this, I've got four people who have long histories on different sides of this debate. They'll have 7 minutes each to speak, and then we'll throw it over to questions. So first of all, I have got, I'll do it in the order that they're sitting. So I've got Jean-Francois from the University of Genewa. Jean-Francois is an international expert on e-cigarettes and has over 20 years' experience in smoking etiology, prevention and cessation research. His research has been crucial in shaping our understanding for the reasons and patterns of e-cigarette use. I think vapers will probably remember him most for trying to educate the EU Commission on the subject with varying degrees of success. In 2015, Jean-Francois published a paper for debate entitled "Should Academic Journals Publish E-Cigarette Research Linked to Tobacco Companies?" So next to Jean-Francois, I have, if I can flick through and find it, Neil McKeganey. Neil is the founding director of the Centre for Drug Misuse Research at the University of Glasgow. He's written over 150 academic articles, including Controversies in Drugs Policy and Practice. He's a sociologist by training and has undertaken research in many areas of drug use and policy. The Centre for Drug Misuse Research has undertaken research funded by Nicotine Ventures, which is a division of BAT. Next to Neil is Scott Leischow. Scott leads the research on health equity and community health program at the Mayo Clinic in Arizona, and co-leads cancer prevention and control with the Mayo Clinic Cancer Centre. Most of Scott's research focuses on pharmacological and behavioural treatments for tobacco dependence and systems and network approaches to public health. He's also editor-in-chief of the journal Tobacco Regulatory Science, which currently does not accept manuscripts funded or conducted by or on behalf of the tobacco industry. And we also have Chris Proctor. Chris is the Chief Scientific Officer and Group Head of Scientific Product Stewardship at BAT. He's represented BAT in public hearings on the World Health Organization's FCTC and its study group on tobacco regulation. He's also chaired 2 steering groups of the European Policy Centre on the Use of Science in Regulatory Decision-Making and Better Regulation. So if we could start with you, Jean-Francois.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me, and good morning. I want to briefly examine the question of whether scientific journals should or should not publish research funded by the tobacco industry. There are conflicts of interest on the side of the of the tobacco industry that explain why some journals reject their papers. First, the money, of course. The money that they can make with the research may skew the interpretation of the results. Then, of course, the tobacco industry has a history of misconduct. They have systematically produced fake research, bogus research. They have produced ignorance and doubt in a systematic way during years, and the journals have been fooled and used, and they are probably angry at this, so it's a measure of retribution for this behavior. And then, of course, these things may apply also in some measure to other industries, not just the tobacco industry, but what's specific to the tobacco industry is that its product kills half of its users if it's used as intended. So these are the basic conflicts of interest that explain why some journals reject these papers. Now, should they also reject e-cigarette research when it is funded by the tobacco industry? Well, the first three conflicts of interest remain, and you have additional conflicts of interest that the research on e-cigarettes also comes from profit made from cigarettes, when it comes from the tobacco industry, that this research can generate profit on its own, and the profit can be used then to promote cigarettes, and also e-cigarettes brands can be used to promote cigarette brands. So you have the old conflicts of interest and the new ones, which explain and led us to conclude that journals that prohibit or that ban the papers from the tobacco industry have no reason to change their behavior and have no reason to accept the papers on e-cigarettes. Now, should all journals ban e-cigarette research when it's produced by the tobacco industry? Probably not, because a ban is an extreme measure. It has flaws. First, if you ban research, it will take longer to establish the truth, the facts. So in the meantime, more people will die. It narrows the range of the research that is published, especially because, well, there's a lot of money coming from the tobacco industry. And anyway, the FDA accepts the research that's done by the tobacco industry, right? When they apply for an authorization for a reduced risk product, they have to apply with applications of thousands of pages of their own research that the FDA examines. So if the FDA uses it for regulation, then why should journals reject the same research? Bans are a measure of censorship that are contrary to one of the basic principles of science, which is openness. So should then journals accept all the science produced by the tobacco industry based on the traditional measures of peer review and self-disclosure? Well, these measures, as of course you know, are insufficient. They have been insufficient in the past decades to prevent these same journals from detecting the bogus science. Of course, the journals are to blame themselves, because how come during decades they were fooled so easily by the tobacco industry and published these papers which were all fake and bogus? So the journals themselves are to blame, but this traditional peer review system and self-disclosure system is certainly not enough. There's a need for more. There's a need for more oversight of the tobacco industry's research, and of any research anyway, not just the tobacco industry's research, but research by the pharma and by public health agencies, because everyone has conflicts of interest, not just the tobacco industry. Conflicts of interest are prevalent everywhere, including among public health people. They may not be financial conflicts of interest, but you have all sorts of conflicts of interest that exist. So let's go back to three basic principles of science to guide us through the reflection on how we should eventually or possibly reintegrate the pariah, the tobacco industry. And the principles are transparency, openness, and reproducibility. About transparency, there's not just a need of full disclosure, but probably all studies should be pre-registered, registered before they are started, and the analysis plan should also be pre-registered. So we need stronger norms for transparency. We need openness, data sharing. The data should be made public and shared and analyzed by independent researchers. There's probably also a need for third-party observers, third-party independent observers of the research process. It could be an idea. And then about reproducibility, there's a need, obviously, for public funding or other sorts of independent funding to reproduce the studies. You know well that in the genetic field, 95% of the studies are not reproducible, and a recently published paper in the field of psychological research also found that most psychological papers are not reproducible, actually. So these are, I mean, ways forward. It's not, of course, a complete protection against what the tobacco industry used to do, the bogus science, but still it's a way forward. There are guidelines, the top guidelines, transparency and openness promotion guidelines that have been published by some journals recently that can guide us in this direction. And, well, since now the tobacco industry is producing reduced risk product, it may be part of the solution. So we need to rethink our collaboration with them, not just about publishing and science, but also about regulation and tobacco control more generally. You have seen earlier this morning that WHO doesn't want to have anything to do with them, but clearly it's not a realistic solution since the FDA itself is considering their research. So I don't have the solution, but clearly we need to rethink our potential collaboration with the tobacco industry, and just saying we're not talking to them is not enough. But of course some people would be very angry at me if I said that we should collaborate more openly. I don't have the solution, but I think we are at a point where we need to rethink this collaboration. Thank you.
You?
Yes, I'm not going to defend the tobacco industry in any of my comments. That many people would regard that as indefensible anyway, but that's not the contribution I want to make. I want to make some observations about science. And in some ways that might seem a rather esoteric concern from which most people have very little interest. And yet it is a hugely important area of human activity, and it's clear that science influences policy in this area as in others, to good effect and to adverse effect on occasion, which makes the issue of science and what contributes to science an important domain for everybody here and beyond these rooms. And I think it's true as well to say that there are a few things more invigorating in public debate and political considerations than to speak from a position of moral certainty, where it is easy to cast one's opponents as the bad guys and to retain a view that one has one's own view of superiority. And I think that that's a very dangerous position to hold. And it's a fundamentally non-scientific position to hold, because there is in science a very strong division between knowledge and belief. Now, people may vigorously adhere to certain beliefs, but that doesn't constitute knowledge. The burden on science, in a way, is a burden of skepticism and the willingness to set aside one's preferred views, however urgent those views are, and to consider the evidence wherever that evidence leads. And that rather counsels against the imposition of political judgments about whose research can count, one group's research being given priority over another group's research. Now that actually is precisely what happens here today in relation to tobacco industry funded research. We have influential journals that are managed by small groups of individuals, on occasion a handful, and on occasion a single editor, who makes judgments about what is the appropriate research to publish, to what is the appropriate research to subject to peer review, which is our strongest means for determining the quality of the research which is undertaken, the peer review process. but we have in operation individuals making judgments that even prior to that process being acted, saying this body of research is not fit for public or professional airing. Now, that actually, however confident the editors and the editorial boards are who make those judgments, that sets a very dangerous precedent. Because it's the precedent that is being set is that I, or people like me, have the authority to determine what people like you and you should see. And if I am unhappy with the quality of the research, I'm not even going to ask for it to be critically considered. And I think that whilst we may solicit a degree of approval where we marginalise industry-funded research in those judgments, there are other judgments that may be applied which are much less comfortable, which are much more discomforting, but are in essence the same principle, wherein which a small group of individuals decide what everybody else should actually be witness to. And I think that contradicts a very fundamental and important principle of science, that we should look at the evidence and we should see where the evidence goes and we should report the findings from that evidence. And it seems to me that if one is inclined to say that a body of research where it's received funding from industry is simply not going to be published, one brackets off an enormously important potential contribution to scientific understanding. I don't actually think that we are in the luxurious position of having an excess of knowledge in this area and in others. So I don't think we should be comfortable about the judgment that says this body of evidence is not even worthy of professional or public airing. It's going to be marginalised, locked away, unseen and undiscussed. However, this other body of research is worthy of public and professional consideration, and we want you to actually discuss it. Now, in a way, it's ironic that that judgment should be attached to industry-funded research, because it's not that long from when the industry itself was heavily criticised for sitting on its own research on the harms of smoking and not actually telling other people about those harms. So we have a rather ironic situation in which here's an industry that's castigated for not telling people about the harms that it was aware of, which is now told, we're not interested in what you tell us about the harms of your products and how those may be reduced, because we're not going to actually allow them any professional or public airing. That's more than an irony. It's a potentially dangerous position to hold when there is no reason at all why the industry, which you might say is responsible for initiating many of the harms which we're here and in other gatherings to address, determines that it has the responsibility also to undertake research to explore the contribution which reduced harm products might make. That seems to me an entirely legitimate area of research, and one which should be subjected to the highest requirements of scientific research, entirely open and transparent procedures, and the replication of studies. I think in a situation where governments, US governments, the EU governments, are requiring industry to initiate research, it is not only an anachronism, it's fundamentally injurious to then say we want the industry to do research on the very products that it's seeking to market, but we are not going to let anybody publicly or professionally see that research. The requirement, it seems to me, is to replicate studies where there is concern about the findings of those studies, and those concerns are not specific sole matter of industry-funded research. We have seen research published only in the last few weeks where it may be said there is concern wherein the interests of funders may have influenced the findings as they are reported, including through the media. So industry-funded research is not alone in these concerns, and they are to be addressed not by curbing communication and curtailing the sharing of information and the transparency of data, but maximising the openness and transparency of the scientific process. That's my 7 minutes, but that's my initial contribution anyway.
Yes, thank you, Nick. Scott.
Good, thank you. So let me just, so I'm the editor-in-chief of a fairly new journal, Tobacco Regulatory Science, and we've been we've had this journal going for a little over a year and a half. And I'll just tell a little bit about how we got things started and how we came to our decision, and Jean-Francois said a little bit of the rationale. So when we created this journal, we put together a senior advisory group, a group of experts, and if you go to the website for the journal, which is www.tobreg.org, you can see the list of senior scientists who would provide guidance and advice to the journal. And so we knew that the question of tobacco industry funded research is one that we would have to address in a very specific way. And when I consulted, or when we consulted with this group, I mean the group basically said no. I mean, there are a few people that disagreed, but for the most part, the senior group said, not a good idea. And in our decision to do this, it was not one made joyously. I mean, because many of us, me included, have a fundamental belief in free exchange of information. At the same time, there are extenuating circumstances that that really came into play here, and that we think are relevant for the discussion. And but let me say what the policy is basically. So we don't accept papers that are funded by the tobacco industry, and that's broadly defined. If an investigator obtains products from the tobacco industry to do research, then we look at that on a case-by-case basis. And then if the research is funded by a company that produces nicotine products, whether it's NRT or vape products or e-cigarettes, and they don't have an association or don't have an affiliation with the tobacco industry, we do allow that. We haven't gotten any, but we would allow that to be considered. But we also recognize that this is a dynamic consideration, and so we set up a process where at minimum every year I consult with the advisory group. We do an email exchange or dialogue and say, okay, is this still the way that we should go? Because the times are changing. So, and let me just summarize again the rationale for this, and again Jean-Francois touched base on some of them, but these are the reasons why. Number one, the issue of tobacco companies selling a product that we know kills. I mean, everybody pretty much acknowledges that now. It's not disputed. And the goal is to continue increasing those who use tobacco, continue selling it, expanding the markets. Even BAT's website says, we see future growth in low-income countries as their wealth increases, as population increases. So there's an intent to get more people to use and ultimately get addicted to tobacco, and of course the resulting tobacco harm from that. And there's a proven history of tobacco companies undermining public health efforts. Tobacco companies have, in the United States, been convicted of racketeering, and that includes concealing research data and denying that nicotine was manipulated. History of marketing to kids. And there's no stated intent by any of the companies, public stated intent to discontinue selling a product that we all know kills many millions of people. And so there's not any remorse. There's no intent to change that behavior. Granted that companies now are producing alternative products, which is absolutely wonderful to see. But from what it looks like from some of our perspectives, it's another product line. It's a hedging, but with no necessary intent to discontinue tobacco sales, combustible tobacco specifically. And then lastly, the one that was discussed here as well is the notion that somehow these data have to be published to be useful and relevant. Well, that's actually not true. The FDA, for example, they're going to review the data whether it's published in a journal or not. and I've confirmed that. I mean, it's not required to be published for it to be relevant. And so there's a perspective that, that really, number one, there are plenty of venues to disseminate information, disseminate data. It could be on websites and so on. So the general, sort of notion here is that really the publications by tobacco companies really aren't necessary. They in effect are advertising for the tobacco company. It's in order to it's done in order to create relevance in the field, to develop linkages in the field, and so those are some of the rationales. Now, having said that, it's not. Those are all reasons that we, PLOS Medicine, Tobacco Control, other journals have made this decision. But again, it's something I would want to review and review regularly. Unfortunately, the challenge is that, for example, we had a colleague and senior scientist step down from our advisory because we don't allow tobacco industry funding, and I respect that decision. But unfortunately, when that happens, then there's no dissenting views, and there's nobody who's going to come in and say to me and the rest of the group, "Hey, I disagree with this." So I'm hoping that that our senior group will not be all homogeneous in their views. We want to get dissenting views and different perspectives, and quite frankly, if there's a view among the scientific advisory group that we should change our approach, then we can change our approach. This is not written in stone.
Thanks, Scott. Just for full disclosure, I'm Chris Proctor. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer for British American Tobacco, which is a tobacco and nicotine manufacturer. We make cigarettes, tobacco heating products, snus, and e-cigarettes. I was interested, Scott and I were now nearly 14 years ago on a Socratic dialogue in the United States Society for Research in Nicotine Tobacco conference, and we had Stan Glantz on the panel, there were a couple others, and we were debating what would it take for tobacco industry research to be accepted, and I was still debating. Okay, so it's good to be back on track on this one. I think my fundamental issue here is I think that in this world of vapors, the more quality research we can do quickly, the better the policy outcomes. I am convinced the more research that comes on the table, the more it will demonstrate the difference between cigarette smoking and vapor usage. And so getting data from all sources is critically important. What we are doing is ensuring we, at the very least, characterize the products that we're bringing to market. So that's the Vite range in particular. And this year you'll see from us around 15 publications looking at the full chemical characterization, looking at in vitro toxicology, looking at systems biology, which integrates lots of biology, and looking at clinical studies, all on Vite to try and demonstrate what we think Vite will perform like compared to a cigarette. And it's always compared to a cigarette. We then are doing additional research looking at kind of broader issues like how do you steward in this world of ever-evolving products. So how do you look at flavors and how they interact with the devices? How are vapors using the devices, and how do you bring that back into your risk assessment process? And we're being reasonably successful in that science. We've published over the last 4 years hundreds of articles in a range, about 130 articles in around 57 different journals. So although I'd love to publish in Scots, there are still outlets that I can publish in. What I do think, though, is there is a fundamental problem, and I think tobacco industry research has a double jeopardy. I mean, the first is the obvious concerns that anyone has of any commercial enterprise publishing on its own products, because there is bound to be at least a perception that that company would want research to be supportive of its products. So I think that's the first one. But of course, and we're very much minded by A Billion Lives as the start of this conference, there is a deep history of misconduct which sets the bar even higher to get to a place where you can start to trust any of this research. So the fact of denial of smoking causing lung cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and respiratory diseases, the whole lights debacle, hangs heavy round the neck of tobacco researchers and is bound to and should. So the question is, can you move from that place of absolute deep, dire mistrust to a place where the data is at least accepted to journals? And I think what Jean-Francois was saying, there's an awful lot to that. So what we've been trying to do over the last decade is kind of start again with where we were. We actually, one of the problems were we never published anything. And if we went to a conference, we'd go to a safe tobacco conference with other tobacco scientists, so no one actually could criticize you. So we try to flip that completely. And I think our challenge, because of that second part of the double jeopardy, is to be more open and transparent than any other commercial R&D, to the extent that you can. So we've opened our doors. We've done one really fundamental thing that Jean-Francois was talking about. We obviously register any clinical study we do. That's kind of common practice now. But more than that, we issue a report. It's called our Science and Technology Report. And it covers all our science areas, chemistry, biology, clinical work. And it sets out what we intend to do over the next year or second year, so people can see, okay, what studies we say we're going to do, what were our primary objectives of them, so someone can come and ask us, so what happened to that? Did you bury that? What happened to that research? So a starting point of transparency, we might want to end up a bit more precise than that. We've opened our doors, so we have scientific conferences down at our R&D in Southampton. People come in, they look around. We've got visiting scientists currently from China working at the bench in our labs. You might have seen for those of you who are British, have seen the BBC Horizon show on e-cigarettes called Miracle or Menace. We got featured quite heavily that, at least our science did. That was because we opened our doors and allowed the BBC journalists in to look at absolutely everything we do, and they found some of our science interesting, and Dr. David O'Reilly, our Director of Science Research, got to explain to them our view that electronic cigarettes or electronic vaping products are substantially safer from the data that we've got compared to cigarettes. We've reversed where we've gone, so our bench scientists go to cancer conferences. And when we started this, Socratic Diet was an interesting example with Stan Glantz on the panel as well, but I've been to a bunch of poster sessions where I know the people coming up to me actually would really like to spit on me. It hasn't quite happened yet, but you still always get that feeling. And a bunch of my young guys and girls scientists, bench scientists who've been at this conference here, get that, but it's really important that we understand the feeling of revulsion still by a lot of the tobacco control community about the fundamental product we sell, despite what we're trying to do, I think, to evolve the portfolio. So the stuff we are doing, is it sufficient yet? I don't think it is, but we'll continue to do it. We'll try and make sure that our science is as open and transparent as possible.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to all our four speakers. So there's quite a kind of a wide range of views, but also I noticed quite a lot of head nodding in there, so I think there's probably a bit of a consensus on a lot of the areas as well. So does anybody have any questions? Oh, wow. There are microphones, so Tom, if you can just wait for the microphone.
Tom Prue from Masita in the UK. We've had a lot of discussion about funding bias, particularly as it relates to the tobacco industry. But of course that is not the only source of bias in science. And it's something that Neil kind of skirted around the edge of, which is that there's also ideological bias, which in some ways is possibly even worse. And how do we get around that? Do we need to have a revamp of peer review as a whole? Because clearly it's failing. And you know, how do we make science more scientific?
Jean-Francois, Neil, do you want to answer that?
Well, clearly what we are seeing in this field is doing a lot of damage to public health in general, because you see scientists taking sides and using the same studies to say the exact opposite things. It's hugely damageable to the field, and I don't see how we can solve it, because, well, editors also are maybe biased since they accept these sort of papers or interpretation of the data, because you have the study and then you have the interpretation and then you have the press release and then you have the press paper, and at each step it's more and more biased. So I don't see how we can get rid of this.
Well, like Jean-Francois, I'm not sure how we get rid of it, but I know how we don't get rid of it, which is by making science less transparent. I think our best touchstone here is to make these judgments as open as possible. I think in a way it's reassuring that Scott refers to a board of advisors who are periodically consulted. However, I think one should be cautious before over-celebrating that, because it sounds rather like asking actors whether they vote for live theatre. The people who are making these judgments are always going to say, I'm quite comfortable making these judgments. And I think scientists are often guilty of a kind of groupthink within which it's quite difficult to actually express a contrary view. You have to be extraordinarily thick-skinned amongst one's scientific colleague to question an orthodoxy. So I'm not sure that the editorial board who are exercising these judgments is the right constituent group to ask about the rightness of exercising these editorial judgments. I think the process itself should be much more transparent. And I have to say, you know, in 25 or so years of research, I've had more intervention from civil servants on publicly funded research that I've carried out than I have ever had from the research we've been recently carried out, assisted by funding either from the nicotine industry or the tobacco industry. They have been extraordinarily hands-off. I have never executed a study where the civil servants have been hands-off. They have been directly interested in what we're saying, whether it embarrasses the sitting minister or not, whether they want to encourage us to publish or want us to hold up publications. So the ideological influence here is by no means constrained to a single domain. And of course it isn't, because not least of which we have the pharmaceutical industry that has a direct commercial interest and who are not excluded from many of these journals that exercise exclusion in relation to the tobacco industry. So I think that, I don't know how we improve this process, but curtailing the transparency of the process is absolutely not the right way to go through with it. And one final comment. You know, I'm sympathetic when somebody says, I respect free speech, but then I'm actually going to make a judgment that curtails free speech. I don't think we can do that. I don't think the burden, the obligation on free speech does not allow you today to turn it on, tomorrow to turn it off. It is an onerous responsibility to enable other constituent groups to undertake the research, adhere to the highest scientific standards, and seek scrutiny of the work that they execute. If we curtail that process, we weaken the contribution of evidence to improving public health.
I don't have a solution for it. I would just say, I don't think that there's any interest or intent to restrict free speech just because a particular type of science is not included in a particular type of journal. There are plenty of other venues for the expression of those data. So there's no restriction of speech. So I would disagree if that's what you're saying. But having said that, I mean, this is a messy process, and I think that there's no easy answer to this, and that to me is a challenge. That was one of the reasons why I actually suggested coming up here and doing this session, to Jerry. I said, we need to talk about this, because we don't, when we put this journal together, we didn't go into it saying, oh, we're going to be, take an advocacy position. We don't want to take an advocacy position. We didn't go into this, with the intent of saying we want to restrict. We wanted to create a journal, and we pulled together, scientists and got their input. But you're right, that's not a perfect process either. And I don't know what process would be better. So that's why I think the dialogue is important, and that's something that, even though I may have a disagreement with some things tobacco industry is doing, I think it's important to have dialogue, to explore options and ideas and where we need to take this.
Chris, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, a quick one. I think it was incredibly frustrating having to see Dr. Farsalinos repeat studies because the first studies were appallingly done. You think that is such a shame that such an eminent researcher who could be doing forward-looking research is having to go backwards to kind of recover. Part of the problem may not be the journal, it may be the fact that people haven't done the core science. So the fact that vapor products can create toxicants when they're at a cycle where they're not wicking properly is probably not understood by the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, you know, or any of the people who reviewed it. So we need to get those kind of core obvious sciences on the table very early to say, well, of course you got that result because of the way you did the experiment. So,
But wouldn't that be indicative of a failure of peer review?
it is, but you know, the guys that review for the New England Journal of Medicine had never seen a vapor product properly.
Well, they're not peers.
So, well, they're not peers. Well, they're peers of a medical research, they're not peers of this kind of research. So, getting core, foundation, fundamental science out there. So, this is a technique you should apply to measure a vapor product. If you do it in this way, you'll get a false result because no one does that in real life. It's just core. And until we get to that place, which is my argument, more not less science, because otherwise you're going to get these false negatives coming out there simply because people don't understand the experiment they're actually doing in the first place.
Deborah has a question, and then...
Deborah Arnott from ASH. I just feel we're operating in a bubble here. We've just come to the end of a very long court case in the UK on plain packaging, which, Chris, your company was involved in, and Neil, you were involved giving evidence for the industry. And the judge, it was an overwhelming defeat for the tobacco industry for many reasons, but one of them was that the industry was challenging the evidence and using expert witnesses while not revealing any of their internal evidence and expert knowledge about the impact of packaging and of the policy measure. And, you know, Neil, you didn't do anything then to try and get the tobacco industry to make its documents public or to use them in your review of the evidence. And Chris, you know, you talk about tobacco industry being allowed to publish its evidence, but it's always only chosen what it wants to publish. And that's, you know, Scott talked about that. That's one of the reasons why it's not been allowed to publish in a number of fora, because it was distorted evidence and it didn't cover the full range of the research that had been done. So how do you respond, the both of you, to my charge of hypocrisy?
No, thank you, Deborah. I mean, I think a test of this principle is, would we publish things that are adverse to the company interest or to our products? And so, I mean, it's a perfectly reasonable challenge. And to be honest, I don't know evidence on plain packaging. I'm kind of live in the scientific world. We'd have to get one of the other guys to talk to that. But in the scientific world, we have absolutely published stuff which would not be of our interest. So we expended a huge amount of energy trying to find out whether reduced toxicant cigarettes could be less risky. And it would have been of great advantage if we actually found that to be the case. So we did. We created a prototype product which had less toxins than any other cigarette anywhere in the marketplace. We did extensive chemistry, biology. We did 2 clinical studies. The second clinical study was a 6-month clinical study where we switched people to these products, and we found there was no benefit of those products, and we published that. And that was really important. We published that because it made sure no one else was going to make the mistake of going down that route. It internalized our thinking that we've really got to move much faster into electronic vaping products and tobacco heating products and snus. So, and that is the proof of the pudding, whether we reveal things when they don't turn out to be that might be the most beneficial to our company. On the plain pack, I don't know. I'll have to ask someone to respond to that.
So I'll just respond to the accusation of hypocrisy. You know, it's very easy to level abuse at academics for the research they do or the research that they review. Indeed, it's indicative of the very problem which I was alluding to, which is it bespeaks a climate of suspicion and accusation where it is no longer adequate, acceptable to review the evidence unless that review concludes with the politically inclined preferred view. But that isn't science, actually. That's the politics of public health. And I don't disparage the politics of public health, but it is not a scientific exercise. There is nothing wrong about reviewing the published evidence on plain packaging. And it is, to me, fundamentally unacceptable and hypocritical and anti-science to say that one should not even review the published evidence. I don't subscribe to the view, actually, that the industry should be disqualified from doing research. I think it should be required to do research, and that research should be critically assessed. I don't think they should be disqualified from reviewing published research either. They should have that option, as any group has that option to review research. So all I've done, and my colleagues, has been to review the published evidence on plain packaging. Now it's an entirely different process for the courts to determine the rightness or wrongness of that policy, but there is nothing wrong in reviewing the published evidence and contributing those assessments to the court proceedings. And I think it's reprehensible, Deborah, actually, for you to allege hypocrisy on doing nothing more unacceptable than simply reviewing published evidence.
Well, I don't think the judge agreed with you.
Hi, I'm Saul Schiffman, and I guess I want to share a perspective, being, I suppose, on both sides of this issue, maybe on all three sides, since I'm on Scott's board. So those of you who know me know I've been doing academic research on tobacco for a little over 40 years, and recently have been consulting to Reynolds, specifically on harm reduction products, not on combusted products. But it seems to me, and Jean-Francois, you mentioned this, that we really misunderstand what the incentives are, the full range of incentives for people to distort science. And that one of the incentives, which has been touched on, is to get attention. And it turns out that if you publish something that fits with the narrative that nicotine is bad and e-cigarettes are terrible and gateway is a scientific certainty, you are sure to get published, and you're sure to get in the New York Times and so on. And so when I look at what's going on now, and I do think that the tobacco industry's behavior in the past was reprehensible, I think what I'm not going to call it the public health community, but what certain parts of the academic community are doing right now is exactly equivalent. Research is being distorted, overplayed. People are digging for kind of foredetermined conclusions. And conversely, it seems to me that in part to try to make up for reprehensible behavior in the past, that the tobacco companies are actually being unusually open. So if you go look at the posters, you'll see that the work done by PMI or BAT was usually carried out by an independent clinical research organization. And I would argue that that's more transparent and accountable than most of the work coming out of academic labs. So I think the sense of sitting in moral judgment about whose research is worthy and trustworthy, I think is really mistaken and really needs to be updated. And we really need to, you articulated the values of transparency and accountability and replication. I think those are the right values, and those are not based on based on who sponsored the research. So I think we really need to get back to those basic principles.
No. Were there other questions? Catherine.
Hi, Catherine Devlin from ACETA again. Sorry, everybody. I'm hoping I can pour some smoothing oils on what it looks like it might be becoming troubled waters here. I'm wondering if the panel perhaps think that there may be scope to expand on the fantastic work that Jerry Stimson and the New Nicotine Alliance have been doing in getting a much broader range of some of the qualified, often expert scientific consumer advocates that are out there, and many in the academic community, properly qualified, competent expertise from the wider community, not only academics, but often, to extend peer review more widely than it currently is, with a view to making it that bit more robust, as the panel seems to be in agreement is necessary. And I wonder if perhaps you guys, together with colleagues, could collaborate on creating an advancement of that structure that Jerry has begun to put in place, with a view to trying to really look at reforming this in the ways that Jean-Francois, you were indicating are necessary. I think everybody agrees that's necessary. Is there some scope there to perhaps gather more of the wider expertise and extend peer review so that it could actually be really robust?
I think it's a fantastic idea. You know, if that had happened in that the formaldehyde New England Journal of Medicine case, immediately the person who knew actually how these products are used was said, well, you didn't do the right experiment. You know, no one's going to draw on something that's dry wicking like that. So it will be a huge challenge. So I'm handing it over to Scott in a minute to how the journals try and grasp that. But if you're doing research on a consumer product, you should have consumer input in some shape or form. Otherwise, your hairy-fairy academic research may have absolutely no relevance to real life. So, Scott.
I think it's a creative, cool idea. I mean, like you're saying, implementing that is a challenge, but I think that's the challenge that we should be looking at. I mean, much of my research or some of my research, I should say, is community-based participatory research. So what that involves is going into the community, oftentimes even designing studies, in consultation and collaboration with community members, and so then you design it and you make it so that it's relevant to that community. Obviously, you can't do that in all kinds of studies, but the notion of evaluating research not just by pointy-headed scientists, but also the community that it impacts is, I think, a great idea. It's something I'd love to think about, explore how we might do this. And there are ways to do it. I mean, you could have tiers of review. Have scientists and have another tier of community folks. Bottom line is, I think it's a great idea. It democratizes research, I think, in important ways. And it's probably time for us to rethink how we evaluate science, and in a broad sense, and make it a sort of a broader perspective. I think it's a cool idea.
I think, in addition to the thought of, okay, you get to make sure the experiment was realistic, you also get an input on interpretation of the data. So I was very minded by the panel this morning about, well, actually what's missing is a core stakeholder, people who are using these products, on the way this data has been interpreted. So having a mirror to that when someone writes up, well, I think the implications of this research are that no one should ever vape in the world, getting some response to that in a real environment would be a very helpful input back into the journals.
I would in some respects echo what you're saying, because I think that what Jerry and the conference board have done here, as in previous meetings, is they've created an environment within which a diverse range of views, including from research, but not solely from research, can be articulated. And I think that contribution is hugely important in this area and in others, because it often is not the case, actually, that there is that level of openness in the discussions. It is all too frequent that one finds oneself contributing to meetings where there is a sole view, and there is a confidence and a reassurance that I'm talking to like-minded individuals. But that is actually not the reality within which we function for the most part. There is a diverse range of views. And I wouldn't want to encourage the creation of a synthetic consensus. I think that these are challenging issues, as Scott has referred to, and there is a diverse range of views. The requirement, it seems to me, is to ensure that there is the breadth of views being expressed from all of those who have some sort of interest in these matters. The only other thing I would say about the peer review process is that, rather like democracy, it's hopeless, but it's actually better than all the other alternatives. However, I do think that it is subject to change now, because I think the rapidity with which comments can be made to editors about papers that have been published through social media is a development which was clearly not anticipated when the peer review process was first devised hundreds of years ago. And I think that now journal editors should open up the capacity for responses to published papers to rapidly appear. I think if there's any reluctance on that on the part of editors, that is regrettable. It perhaps may not be entirely surprising, because no editor wants to publish a raft of responses saying the paper that they've just published and drawn substantial media attention shouldn't have been published in the first place and have these deficiencies within it. But I think that we should have the capacity in a much broader range of ways to respond to published papers where those papers are very probably influencing public and professional debate on important matters.
I think there are two separate things here. First, the problems with the industry of scientific publication, and then the accountability of people who misbehave and produce these terrible studies. We have a problem with the industry of scientific publication, with an exponential increase in the number of journals and in the number of papers that are published, with new journals appearing online only, with a very light peer review process, just based on financial interests, right? It's a business, it produces money, it's hugely costly to the libraries of medical schools, for instance, to get subscription to all of these journals. These things should be rethought, and well, the medical schools also are guilty because of the pressure to publish, right? If you want to progress in the career, you need to publish, and the quantity of the publication is still a criterion. So there's something that needs to be rethought here, and we should, as my colleagues just said, move just beyond the traditional peer review process with reproduction of studies, data sharing, third parties, publication of the study protocols, not just for clinical trials, but for all sorts of studies, and pre-publication of the analysis plans. Now, about the accountability of people who misbehave, the tobacco industry in the end was held accountable, but when will public health people who also misbehave be held accountable? I don't know when this is going to occur, but still, I think that journals have a responsibility. For instance, it's amazing to see how many papers conducted in a small sample end up with policy recommendations. These policy recommendations come from nowhere, but it's really extremely frequent in this field specifically to see policy recommendation at the end of a paper based on data. Some journals, like Addiction, for instance, have strict guidelines on how to write the abstract and the conclusion, and will not let you derive policy recommendations based just on any set of data. So there's also a responsibility of editors to filter, I think, these things. But we need to go beyond the traditional peer review process. As you said, there's currently a pre-publication peer review, but why not introduce a post-publication peer review, a peer review of the study protocols, and there's also a need for standardization of the measures. As Linda Bolt said yesterday, you can't go on with every scientist using his own measure. We need to have a standardization of the measures, of the behavior, etc. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Okay. Where's the mic?
I think once again, vaping is disrupting a lot of things, including the peer review process. I think, you know, it's been a learning curve for everybody. And what I actually saw in the last few years, it was because NIH and FDA was providing funding for these type of research, a lot of US researchers were forced to publish something very quickly in order to have, you know, a chance and to get that funding. So I can see a conflict of interest there as well. I mean, conflict of interest needs to be disclosed at all levels, ideological, scientific, and that would be a solution to the problem. If you have a conflict of interest, you disclose it. Then the readership, the public, the fellow scientists will judge you for that. But you know, there's an ethical, moral, and now even legal requirements for companies that they are marketing products that may have an impact on the human health to publish their own data. So it is very important what Kathleen just said, that we really need to find a structure or a system or a method in order to have this knowledge. I mean, I've learned a lot from having long discussion with papers. And that's the only way I could actually design proper studies without, well, I made mistakes anyway, but we all make mistakes. But at least I try to minimize those mistakes. And again, as I said before, we're on a steep learning curve, still everybody, and there'll be a lot to learn. So it'll be a fantastic idea to try to have more knowledge base on board of the peer review system, because the editors, what they do, I'm an editor of a scientific journal myself, and I know this guy knows about this methodology, he knows about the pharmacology, I'll put these two people together. But if one of the two guys doesn't know the pharmacology of the drug that is being addressed in the specific paper, it's going to be a faulty peer review process.
Just a couple of comments. Yeah, and I agree that the peer review process is a fundamental challenge. I mean, that's you know, as a relatively new editor-in-chief, that's been one of the, for me, one of the biggest challenges in you know, implementing a journal and trying to do it in the most fair and equitable way, and you know, and kind of doing what you're saying. How do you line up the reviewers, you know, who have the expertise to provide a fair and equitable review of a paper, and it's not an easy thing, and it's never perfect. You know, it's sort of the same thing with grant reviews. I mean, you know, how many of us who are scientists, you know, we apply for grant reviews, and you get the reviews back. It's like they didn't understand. They didn't understand. You know, there's always something, and I don't have an easy solution for that one. You know, to your point, Ricardo, about legal obligation to publish, I'm not sure where that is. In the United States, it's not an obligation, no legal obligation. I mean, they have an obligation if tobacco companies or ENDS companies want to, if they want to have their products regulated, or when they have to go through the regulatory process, they have to submit the data, you know, to the FDA. But there's no obligation that they have to publish it. I mean, scientifically, it's a good thing. I grant you that, but I don't think it's a legal one that they have to publish, as far as I know, anyway.
And I think on the peer review process, there's a real, the publishing industry is still very reluctant to move into the modern transparent world. So there is a movement to try and push openness and transparency in reviews, but highly resisted. So it's a little bit like the FCTC process, actually trying to figure out what went on when your paper went into the journal, when it kind of comes out again with either reject or minor revisions or accept. You actually don't know, and no one else knows who was reviewing. Now, it's probably more challenging for journals to get reviewers are happy to do their review in public, but actually they're playing such an important role in the scientific process, they should be really happy to be shown that they were not only contributing to this, but their opinions they could stand behind. So, I was at a American Chemical Society meeting on scientific integrity that I was presenting at a couple of years ago, with all the various journals coming up with new mechanisms. And that one, very much in there, also post-review as well, but there's a great resistance to it from the traditional publishers.
Clive.
Hi. Jean-Francois, I was really pleased that you mentioned post-publication
peer review, which I think in many ways will be the future of accountability in this. I was going to ask you guys what you think of PubMed Commons and PubPeer and these sort of platforms for doing effectively post-publication peer review. I'm doing them myself. It's like a kind of therapy. When a sort of terrible study comes out, I'm going to write a peer review, and it's like, oh my God, you know. But is this a forlorn and pointless waste of time, or would you encourage others to do this? With the industry, with its science base, would you consider starting to do these things as straight down the line, you know, hard-nosed peer reviews of some of the worst papers that come out? Is that an effective or useful direction to take?
Well, I mean, I think any additional voice in response to publications is actually to be welcome. I mean, I don't think the quality of those voices is assured by the fact that they've been given a platform. So I think there will still be issues to do with the quality of the commentaries, as there are issues to do with the quality of the research. But I don't think one should curtail that avenue through which communication can take place. I think actually journals have to shift massively, because it's totally unacceptable actually that you have often publicly funded research appearing in journals which are owned by private companies who then charge a substantial amount of money to allow people to actually read those articles which they have funded through their tax. So I think that there's a wide shift away from the restrictive dissemination, which has been a characteristic of journal publishing for many decades, and we are now seeing a range of platforms through which academic work is being discussed. But I think that there is also now an increasing obligation on the parts of journals and their managing owners to open up, to ensure that it isn't only other academics whose access to the journals is assured because their institution can pay those substantial fees to get access to those papers, but that anybody with an interest in those papers, and indeed I think that should be extended to data as well. I think that there is all too many occasions where people refuse access to their data. They hold it as if it were a personal possession, when in reality it's the details of people's lives. Researchers do not own those details of people's lives. They've often been conveyed to researchers in a belief that that's part of the process of improving public health and public standards. But they're often closed and closeted and owned privately by researchers, when I would urge researchers to be much more open about their data and much more open about publishing within journals.
I'll stop you there, Scott, because I've got two more questions I want to get in, unless you've got anything you vehemently want to disagree.
Well, just really, no, not so much disagree. I mean, I think the system's changing. It's, you know, we're moving toward an open access system. The fundamental point I want to make is that and we're not part of any big multinational corporation. It's a small effort that we've implemented, and publishing is not free. And there are costs involved in this, and those costs have to be recuperated somehow. So if it's open access, which I think open access is outstanding, then the cost for getting those papers in place is going to be borne by the people submitting it up front. I mean, in other words, you know, somebody's got to pay to do this because there is a cost to it. I mean, so I just need to make that point. The notion of open access makes huge sense to me, and I think that's where the field is moving.
Okay. Yeah. I just want to take a question from the gentleman.
Sure, quick question. Mitch Nides. Scott, has there been any discussion among the board to not necessarily treat the industry monolithically, but to take on a case-by-case basis with potentially a pathway to publication where, you know, you're saying, well, if you do this and this and this and this, so a reward or an incentive for the industry to be able to publish in publications?
Yes, I mean, last fall I posed it to the group, and what I pitched to them is a question: should we, for example, allow publications by companies that make smokeless tobacco, Swedish Match or companies like that, that clearly have a different impact on health than combustibles. And at least so far, the board has said, no, let's leave it at all tobacco companies. And so, that's one approach that we pitched. I didn't approach it in exactly the way you were suggesting about, some incentive. I mean, it seems to me that it would be easier for me to push harder or encourage the board more if a tobacco company CEO came out publicly and said, in X amount of time, we anticipate getting out of the combustible tobacco business. I mean, obviously, I'm not naive. Obviously, shareholders are going to be a little bit concerned about that, probably. But why not? To me, that would make it a lot easier to say, what can we do to help support the tobacco industry moving out of combustibles and moving, more fully into new directions. But, that really hasn't been discussed amongst our board, because it really hasn't happened, hasn't been done by the tobacco industry. But my orientation is to pitch to the group different ideas, or hopefully if others in the advisory have ideas, my hope is that those will be raised, because again, I recognize this is a changing scenario.
Yeah, I'm Carl Fagerström, and thanks Scott for inviting me to your board, which was a difficult decision, and I thought hard about it, but I decided to not go on the board for various reasons. I am one of the deputy editors of Nicotine and Tobacco Research, which, by the way, does allow tobacco industry-funded research. But what I wanted to bring up here, that is the peer review process a little bit. I don't know how it is in areas outside where I am a scientist, but it is increasingly difficult to get reviewers to review for you. And I suppose that has some effects. As an editor, you get a paper and you think about a couple of reviewers, the best ones most likely, so you ask them, no, decline. So you go down the ladder, you ask the next one, declining, and you go down and you go down. And in the end, we get the papers reviewed, but probably not by the top experts we would like to have made the reviews. And also reviews are coming in sort of shorter and shorter. And maybe this is simply an effect of we are getting so many journals, and all of the journals like to have some form of review. So I wonder, we are not the ones that decide things like this here, but whether it should be an academic merit to have been reviewing papers also. Maybe that could make the best ones more interested in taking part in the process and keep the quality of it.
Carl, it's a great point. I mean, it is challenging, and because I do reviews for many journals myself. I regularly have one sitting on my desk that I need to get to, just like everybody else. So it's definitely a challenging process because the demands are high, and one wants to do a good job. So. Yeah, again, I don't have a solution for it. I mean, one of the ways that we've approached it is that we have two tiers of advisors, if you will. So we have the senior advisory group, which is senior scientists. That's why I invited you and Saul and others. And then we've got associate editors. So associate editors are people who, they send me their CV. I review it. I look, have they got the scientific expertise to review in various areas? And then if they do, then we make them associate editors. So that's something they can put on their CV. So then, in fact, they can get some academic credit for serving as an associate editor. And then the expectation is that they'll review 2 papers a year, basically. So, but even still, it's a challenge because, again, everybody is so busy, and we truly do the best that we can to get the best possible reviews. Am I always happy with the reviews? Of course not. I mean, you know, as an editor, you know, that's one of the biggest challenges that I experience. So, but there's no easy solution.
I think the other one, and one of the big ideas I heard from this panel was getting consumer advocates involved in this whole process, is the peer review tends to be very narrow. So if it's a toxicology, it's a toxicologist or a toxicologist or a toxicologist or a toxicologist. And actually broadening it out, trying to review, okay, experimental design, the fundamental science of toxicology, and then the policy implications, and then having a broader church of reviewers might be a really interesting way, not only to broaden the pool that's looking at the paper, but having different perspectives looking at not only how was the science done, but how is the interpretation coming out.
Before we end, I wanted to make another point that has not yet been talked about here. It's about the awareness of researchers and reviewers of the conflicts of interest. We may think that the people from the other side are just dishonest, whereas in fact they may just not be aware of their own conflicts of interest. This is something that can be done by education, by educating people and making them aware of the research, that it's a perfectly researchable field, the conflicts of interest, and the unconscious conflicts of interest that we all have. So by conducting research on this and educating the scientists and the students also about this, I think we can make progress.
It's going to have to be the last question.
Yeah, so I'll just be quick, just a comment on that, because I edit nicotine tobacco research with Carl. The other problem for us is that the reviewers, this is such a new field that a lot of people who are reviewing don't necessarily know what they're reviewing, or they don't know the literature. So we really have a challenge there with early career staff. But the question I wanted to ask was about the role of funders. I don't think you mentioned this. I missed the beginning of the session. Are there specific things that research funders can do to improve some of these issues? I mean, there are ideas like registered reports, for example, where a funder would partner with academics, and their protocol would be agreed as the bid, and then it would be guaranteed publication in a journal. That's one idea. But are there other things that the research funders could do? I'm interested in your views on that.
Data sharing, for instance, allowing third-party observers on the facility when they're conducting research, and these are two ideas.
Yeah, I would agree. I think data sharing, which is actually an increasing requirement that funders make, that data should be archived and then available for others to examine. I think that's been identified as an important principle. I think that's something that we should seek to implement much more widely.
No, I mean, we did talk a little bit about it, and the challenge is, I think, to be as transparent as possible about the research that's going to be done before you do it, and set out exactly what the purpose is, what the primary objectives are. So there's a trackability of the intent of research, and then you've got much more of a hope of being able to come back and say, okay, A, the research was published, and B, the whole process worked quite well. I think partnering with third parties too is a really good idea. So there's lots of mechanisms. We've made a start at it. We've got a long way to go on that, but we'll kind of try and push that further.
Okay, so it's 2 minutes past lunchtime. So if you wouldn't mind thanking our speakers.